So today's message, I have drawn the title from something Jesus says in this passage that we've looked at, Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29. It's a faithless generation is the title, a faithless generation. When it says at the beginning of this passage, I'm going to have a hard time turning pages this morning. When it says at the beginning of this passage that they came to the disciples, it's speaking of Jesus, Peter, James, and John coming down from the mountaintop where Jesus was transfigured, which we spoke of last time when we were in the book of Mark. So they're coming down from the mountain, and that experience on the mountain was incredible. It has been talked about, or you may have heard talked about, mountaintop experiences. We talked about this. I was thinking this morning actually of a song written by Stephen Curtis Chapman talking about being up on the mountain. And that's an expression that Christians might use about being at a high point. People talk about mountaintop experiences. If you could ever think of a mountaintop experience, though, that was incredible, it was truly what Peter, James, and John experienced. They experienced really the transfiguration of Jesus, seeing a greater reality, seeing the curtain pulled back, and talk about a reason to have great faith. And yet now they're coming back to normal life. And normal life that they encounter, we encounter the same things in the world around us, the world with its problems, its turmoil, its dissensions. So we're going to look at four things here that they come to. The first is the situation. What is it they're encountering as they come down from the mountain? There is a crowd with the other disciples, and there are scribes that are arguing with the disciples. So here we have a problem right to begin with. You can see right as they come down, there's a crowd around them and an argument going on. When Jesus enters the scene, though, it says that the crowd looked at him and they were amazed, and they approached Jesus. So there's a real contrast here that we're beginning to see right off the bat. Jesus is in a different category from the disciples who are just there arguing with the scribes. When Jesus comes on the scene, everybody immediately goes to him. And the problem, the specific problem, is presented to Jesus. When Jesus asks what is happening, what is being argued about, there's not a direct answer given, but a man from the crowd says, "I brought my son for healing, but your disciples were unable to help." The disciples clearly here were not strong enough or powerful enough to deal with the problem of this man's son having this spirit. And so the child is not healed. That's one thing we see in this situation. The child is not healed. And the other thing we saw was that the disciples are arguing with the scribes. This is a complete contrast to what we see about Jesus, because the disciples lack power and lack authority. They couldn't heal the son, and they couldn't deal with the scribes in this situation. Probably because they couldn't heal the son, the scribes were using this as an accusation to say, once again, you're not really who you claim to be. And the disciples had no answer. We know when Jesus encountered these situations, he could always heal. And if the scribes ever had a question, there was no argument. He had the perfect answer. That's the situation of the disciples, though. Number two, we have the supplication. Jesus gives a response to this man talking about the problem. And what Jesus says, and this is the title of our message, he says that this is a faithless generation. He says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" A faithless generation. You can hear in the words that Jesus is saying there his exasperation. Because as Jesus has done his ministry, they have every reason to have faith. and believe. And yet over and over, he is met with unbelief. And yet, what does he say right after this? Bring him to me. Even though he's in the midst of a faithless generation, he still wants to help. He still wants to help. And so they bring the boy to Jesus, and immediately the boy begins exhibiting these behaviors. It says, when the spirit saw Jesus, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell to the ground, rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus, in response to seeing this child in this uncontrolled state, asks, how long has this been happening? And the father responds to this. He says, from childhood. Essentially, this has been something that has been a lifelong condition for this child. A lifelong condition. And not only that, the father explains that it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. It's not only lifelong, it is a perilous condition. It is a condition in which the boy's life has been at stake. You can see what's being brought out here, that this is a very, very serious situation. We would even say, from a human standpoint, a hopeless situation. And that's why the father then says to Jesus, if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So you can hear in the way that the father appeals to Jesus that there's doubt and desperation. If you can do anything, help us. And you can see why this man would be struggling, because this is a lifelong perilous problem, and the disciples they've failed to help. And now, right now, even in the presence of Jesus, this boy is convulsing. This father is doubtful and desperate. If you can help us, he says. That's not really an expression of deep faith, though, is it? If you can help us. But we can understand where the father's coming from a human standpoint. And yet Jesus confronts this unbelief. What does Jesus say in response? If you can. He highlights that if you can. If. And then he says, all things are possible for one who believes. And that really brings out God's power and his promise. God's power and his promise. We cannot do things from a human standpoint, but all things are possible from God's standpoint. And for the one who has faith, he can trust God in his power. We must never limit God. We must never limit God. When someone says, if you can do this, that's a limitation on God, isn't it? If you can help. And even though we might look at this from an analytical standpoint and say, yeah, that's right, we shouldn't limit God, how often are we tempted to limit God in our hearts and feel hopeless and not go to God with confidence, knowing that God is truly in control? But what Jesus says here to this man, all things are possible to the one who believes, is something he said in another place when a rich young man came to Jesus and was talking about matters of salvation, and Jesus told him, give up everything you have, come follow me. And the man just walked away. He was sad and sorrowful because he didn't want to give up his possessions. Jesus said to the disciples, truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard that, they were greatly astonished, saying, who then can be saved? From their standpoint, a rich person receiving from a human standpoint the blessing of God, and you're saying it's hard for a rich person? It's so hard, it's like a camel going through the eye of a needle. People have actually tried to explain that by some supposed gate that you could go through if you knelt down or something like that. But there's no actual historical evidence of that. I'm sorry to burst anybody's bubbles if you thought that. What Jesus is saying is that it's easier for a camel to go through. It is an expression to make you go, that's impossible. That's impossible. And if you want to know that he meant it's impossible, look at what he says. Jesus looked at them and said, with man it is what? It is impossible. There are things, including our salvation, that from a human standpoint, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And so even when you discourage about how could God save someone like me, just remember, from your standpoint, it's impossible. But with God, all things are possible. That is the power of God. What are we called to have? Faith. To the one who believes, all things are possible. That's what the rich young man should have responded with when Jesus was confronting him about his life. But instead he walked away because he wanted to hold on to his own righteousness and his own riches instead of trusting in Jesus. Which leads us now back to our story. As Jesus confronts the man and says, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes, we see now the third point, which is the salvation of this boy. He is saved from this condition. The salvation from this condition. The father cries out. That word, cry out, we actually see it with the boy too. The boy, some translations say the boy shrieks. But here, the father's crying out. So there's deep emotion here in what he's saying to Jesus. He cries out to Jesus, I believe. And I love what he says here. I think most of us can resonate with how he expresses this. I believe. I know you're asking me, Lord, to show faith. I do believe, but help my unbelief. Help my unbelief. What incredible honesty there. But that is the correct answer. That is the correct answer. I believe. Help my unbelief. Faith does not mean that you always perfectly believe. And this account really demonstrates that for us. Some people think it's all or nothing. If I can't have perfect total faith, then I can't believe at all. This man says, I believe, but help my unbelief. What an honest description of our human condition. But that's all God is requiring. To exhibit just that mustard seed of faith. And we see that in how Jesus responds. The man says, I believe, help my unbelief. And when Jesus sees the crowd starting to run together, he now turns to the boy, and it says he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. So Jesus accommodates the response, even though it's weak faith, he accommodates that response of faith and commands that spirit to come out of the boy. He rebukes the spirit. Now, as Jesus does that, we kind of see in this situation things get a bit worse, seemingly, before they get better. Because even though Jesus rebukes the spirit and the spirit does come out of him, it says that the boy became like a corpse. So that people started to say, he's dead. So in a way, it looks as if things actually got worse. And that the request has not been answered. But then what happens right after that? Jesus takes the boy by the hand and lifts him up. And I love the way Mark expresses this. And he arose. That should give us encouragement as we're looking ahead to what's coming this week, right? Jesus has the power to raise up. That boy looked dead, but Jesus raised him up. That spirit was now gone. The evil spirit, the mute spirit, and now Jesus raises the boy to new life. Even when it seems most hopeless, God is able to raise to new life. That is certainly the message that we are looking at in this week. When it seems most hopeless, God is able to raise to new life. That leads to the solution, because it really brings up a question in all that has transpired here. It says in verse 28, when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? Why couldn't we do this? And the truth is, they are all helpless, just like us. I actually faced a situation as I was working on this sermon where I felt helpless myself. Because as I was working on this, I heard this commotion outside of our house. And I actually thought maybe it was like animals. It sounded almost like dogs because there was just so much constant noise. But it wasn't dogs, it was actually people who were just so livid and angry, and they were just nearby across the street from our house. And this situation involved an altercation of people yelling and just aggressive in their behavior. And it was so, it was just so heated, and it didn't seem like it was ever going to die down, that I got my phone out and was about ready to call the police myself. But someone who was over there actually said, I'm calling the police. Why were we thinking of calling the police, though? Because we felt helpless. And about the only thing I mustered up the courage and ability to do is when Julie needed to leave for Bible study, actually, I actually walked her to the car. What a hero I am, right? Because I just wanted to do something. But I'm being honest, I didn't do that so much because I'm so chivalrous. I just felt helpless. I wanted to do something, you know? I told her that. I said, I felt like I should do something. Well, that's how the disciples are. They really couldn't help. They really couldn't do anything. And what does Jesus say to them? I'm going to break this down into the phrases he uses. He says, this kind. When they say, how is it we could not cast it out? He says, this kind. So this kind is referring to the demonic activity taking place in this boy's life, which clearly is something very, very powerful. Now, remember, the disciples had done ministry before. And were they able to cast out demons? Yeah. But past success, previous success, does not guarantee future success. Right? Just because they did it before, it didn't mean they could do it in this situation. This kind that they were facing was clearly too much for them. He says this kind, number 2, cannot be driven out. In other words, that's referring to human effort. There's no simple solution to something like this. You're not going to be able to do this. And they needed that check on themselves. They needed to be able to face that and say, there are situations like this we cannot handle. Just because we could do something before doesn't mean we can handle this. And what does he say, though? It cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. And there he gets to it. Could they have helped in this situation? Yes. If they had faith. The father wasn't the only one struggling with faith, was it? Was he? It wasn't just the father struggling with faith. Even the disciples approached the situation in the wrong manner. And their lack of faith might have exhibited itself in presumption, thinking, well, we've done it before, now we can handle this situation now. It makes me think of an Old Testament story I remember hearing even from the time I was a child about the people of Israel in the Battle of Jericho. And in the Battle of Jericho, they relied on God. They walked around the city 7 days, the 7 times the seventh day, and then God brings the walls down. How are they feeling after that? Victorious, right? And then they have to go to another place, and they engage in what's called the Battle of Ai. And that's not talking about artificial intelligence. It's a little town of Ai. Things really take on different meanings in different eras. I thought about that. I would have never thought of that until recently. But they go to this little town and they do a scouting report and they say, you don't need to send everybody because the people there are few. And they think, we just saw God help us at Jericho. We had that victory. We can go ahead and defeat this little town of Ai. And you know what happens to Israel? They're defeated. Because they were presumptuous. Someone had actually sinned and gone against God at Jericho and stolen property they were not supposed to take. And God was angry with Israel. And so when they went to Ai, they were not prepared. And what Jesus is saying to the disciples is, you need to always rely on God and be a person of prayer. And be a person who is never presumptuous, thinking you can handle this situation. They had done great ministry already as disciples, but they were still learning. And what they needed to learn now is to depend on God fully. Some problems that we face we need to remember that these problems are only going to be dealt with through prayer. And I find it so interesting that Jesus summarizes what they need as being prayer. He doesn't talk about other things that they could have done. If they had just recited the right incantation, or if they had just done the right maneuvers. No. He says you need to rely on prayer. It seems like there are even people today that seem to, in some way, project that they don't really need prayer. But let me tell you, we need prayer. No one, other than Christ, has the authority to do what we see today in what we've read in this account. Only God has the power. God's power is the only solution. But here's the encouragement. God's power is enough. Because when Jesus demonstrated the power of God, that boy was delivered. And back to that story I told you about the situation with the neighbors. I can tell you it felt really good when the police showed up. I immediately felt very different. As soon as those police vehicles showed up and the authorities came out, we call them authorities, right? They have authority. You could tell. The situation changed. Listen, God has all authority. And when we look to Him, it gives us a completely different outlook on our situations. So let's just think now about the applications of this. One, we live in an unbelieving generation today too, don't we? We live in a world of agnosticism. That's what we call it today. It's people who are unbelieving. And we'll admit, it can be hard to believe in the world that we live in. We sometimes think that, well, it's harder today to believe than it was back then, but I don't really believe that. I actually think there have always been obstacles to people's faith. And God has given us as many reasons to believe as He gave them. But we do live in an unbelieving generation. It's the kind of the atmosphere we're swimming in is unbelief. Number two, Jesus showed His power in the story, but Jesus continues to show His power today. And people, through the power of Christ, are continuing to come to faith. I want to encourage you actually with a statistic I looked up and read about. This was a study done in the United Kingdom. I'm going to get it out eventually. The United Kingdom. It says the Quiet Revival Report reveals that the decline of church attendance in England, and you know it's bad there, right? It says the decline in church attendance in England and Wales has not only stopped, it is being turned around, and I love this, by Gen Z. And if you don't know what that is, that's the younger generation. That's the young adults of today. Thank you, Gen Z. I see some of you out here. Although Gen Z is often portrayed as being increasingly liberal, anti-organized religion, and highly skeptical of Christianity, a segment of young people may be changing this narrative. The Quiet Revival states that over the last 6 years, those identifying as Christians who say they attend church at least once a month has risen, now again, this is in the United Kingdom, has risen by 50%. This represents a growth from 8% of the population, 3.7 million, to 12% of the population, 5.8 million. And this increase is driven by Gen Z. Another shout out to you guys, Gen Z. Where once we saw aging congregations and a steady decline in attendance, we see dramatic growth led by the young. Where once we saw apathy or even hostility to Christianity and the Bible, we see increased openness again among the young. In 2018, 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they attended church at least monthly. This is now quadrupled to 16%, with young women increasing from 3 to 12%. Now that's a great statistic, but women are kind of often known as being those more likely to attend church. But it increased from 3 to 12% in that several year span. But young men increased from 4% to 21%. I'll tell you, that's a miracle. Seeing men come to church like that in those numbers. Jesus is continuing to demonstrate his power, and people are continuing to come to him. So, number 3 in application, we need to respond. Just like we saw with that man today, we need to respond in faith. And as Jesus told us, the way we exhibit faith is prayer. And what we saw today is a long-standing, hopeless situation. You may be in a situation where you feel like this is a long-standing situation, it's hopeless, it's never going to work out, it's never going to be resolved. But what did we see today? God has the power to deliver, and to deliver fully. That boy was not half healed. He was completely healed. All things are possible, not for us, but for God, to those who believe. That's a word of promise. And I love what Jesus says in John 6:35. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. I say to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. If we come to Jesus, he will accept us. And it is God's work in our lives that brings us to him. So our only hope and our only need, it's not to prove ourselves. It's not to have some sort of this high capacity. It's simply to come to Jesus in our need, to come to him in faith. And it may be the faith of, I believe, but help my unbelief. Maybe that's all you've got. But that's all it takes. Jesus said a mustard seed of faith. If we come to him with that faith, Christ will help us. He will not cast us out. And one more thing. No matter how God answers, his grace will be sufficient for you. The follower and apostle of Jesus, Paul, said this in 2 Corinthians 12:7. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Did Jesus say, okay, Paul, whatever you say? He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. No matter how God answers, he will answer. We are to pray. We are to pray in faith. But no matter how God answers, he will give you the grace that will be sufficient for you in your need. And a great illustration of this, I've been seeing some posts online from a woman. I don't know how old she is. She's younger than me. but she's been talking about being in a terminal illness and facing death. And one of the most recent posts she said is, I'm alarmed today that a body can feel so terrible. So she's admitting how terrible her body can feel in the flesh, and at the same time, full of joy and peace. And this is not my doing. It is a blessing and a gift from my heavenly Father. The abundance of his grace is overwhelming. I'll never get over what he has done for me. And that woman's name is Shelley, by the way. And over, she's been giving testimony day after day of how she goes through these hardships on a physical level, but she has such peace. She has such joy in her heart. And she gives all the credit to the Lord. It sounds like Paul, doesn't it? His grace is sufficient for her. Is God answering her prayers? Absolutely. We don't know how God will answer, but we know that he will give us the grace that is sufficient to help us in our need. We come to God. Yes, we're living in the midst of an unbelieving generation, but we need to come to Christ, just like that man today, saying, I believe, or at least, I believe, help my unbelief. And if we come to God with that prayer and faith, God will answer and give us grace.